My name is Lynn Wagner. I'm a co-PI of the ECOG-ACRIN and core research base and a co-leader of the ECOG-ACRIN Cancer Control and Outcomes Program. We are delighted to hold today's webinar on resources and support for integrating PROs in ECOG-ACRIN trials. We're very excited. Welcome. Thank you for spending time with us today. We're excited to have investigators representing nearly all ECOG-ACRIN committees on the call today, along with our statisticians and many of our colleagues and collaborators from protocol development as well. Just a few important housekeeping notes before we begin. Because of the size of the event, your mic has been muted. We do want to hear from you, and we will have some time built in a little bit for Q&A. So if you want to make a comment or pose a question during today's webinar, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. That opens up a window where you can type in questions and comments and send them to us. We have dedicated 20 minutes at the end of today's meeting for Q&A, and our aim is to respond to all questions during today's webinar. In case time runs short, we encourage you to include your name with your questions so we can follow up with you by email after the webinar in the event that we don't get to your question. As a reminder, we are recording today's session for the benefit of colleagues who are interested in attending but who are unable to attend. This event will be recorded and available later on demand. I have already introduced myself. I'd also like to introduce my co-chairs for the ECOG-ACRIN PRO Working Group, Dave Sella, Larry Wenzel, and Alana Green. And today's webinar is the first in a series that we're planning that is being hosted by the PRO Working Group to support the integration of PROs in ECOG-ACRIN trials. For those who are not familiar with our working group, we are a multidisciplinary team of colleagues with interest in measurement science, along with ECOG-ACRIN members who are interested in collaborating on PRO design, both in the context of therapeutic committee trials with PRO endpoints, as well as in the context of our cancer prevention, symptom science, and control portfolio. As interest in PRO endpoints has grown and PRO science has become a flagship feature of the ECOG-ACRIN and core research base, we recognize the need to offer investigators with support. And these conversations have really grown from discussing the provision of templates to go along with protocols and copies of measures to really more depth in terms of the providing support and interactive and didactic opportunities in PRO measurement science. PRO working group members collaborate with study teams on therapeutic design and cancer control trials, including consultation on PRO design, as well as support and tools and resources that we're going to discuss briefly today and that we'll explore in further webinars. We are also excited to welcome our guest speakers, Dr. Claire Snyder, Michael Brundage, and Claire Krosno here from the PROTEUS Consortium. The PROTEUS Consortium has partnered 27 key stakeholder groups, including the NCI, the FDA, and ASCO, to disseminate and implement tools that can optimize the use of PROs in clinical trials and ensure that patients, clinicians, and other decision makers have high quality PRO data from clinical trials. So we see a great opportunity here to collaborate with the PROTEUS team to help inform and raise the scientific quality of our ECOG-ACRIN PRO research. So a brief overview for today's meeting agenda. I will momentarily turn it over to the PROTEUS team, who will introduce you to guidance documents, checklists, and practical resources that can help you and your study team feel more confident and improve your efficiency with writing PRO protocols, selecting PRO measures, analyzing PRO data, and reporting on findings. Their presentation will be followed by a brief preview of additional resources that we're developing for ECOG-ACRIN investigators. And that, as I've mentioned, we'll have 20 minutes for discussion and for Q&A. Between our guest speakers, Dave Sella, Larry Wenzel, Alana Green, and myself, We have a lot of many years of PRO research, which is represented on today's panel. So we do hope that you take the opportunity to ask questions. For those who may have joined after we started, just a reminder that everyone is muted. You can submit a comment or question at any time during the webinar by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And now I am pleased to turn it over to Drs. Snyder, Brundage, and Krasno here for the presentation from the PROTEUS Consortium. Thank you again, PROTEUS colleagues, so much for your time today.
Thanks, Lynn. And Michael, Nora, and I are really pleased to be with y'all today to share some of the activities of the PROTEUS Consortium, to introduce those of you who aren't familiar with PROTEUS, with what PROTEUS is doing, as well as provide a preview of some of the tools and resources that we are currently creating, some of which we have available to help researchers include PROs in clinical trials optimally. Michael, if you can go to the previous slide. So just to orient everyone, PROTEUS stands for Patient-Reported Outcomes Tools, Engaging Users and Stakeholders. Next slide. I have the pleasure of presenting today with my co-principal investigator, Michael Brundage, and our fantastic project manager, Nora Krasno here. PROTEUS was originally funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and we have continuing funding from Genentech. As Lynn mentioned, the objective of PROTEUS is ensuring that patients, clinicians, and other decision makers have high-quality PRO data from clinical trials to make the best decisions they can about treatment options. And our approach for doing this is to partner with the key stakeholder groups to disseminate and implement tools that have been developed for incorporating PROs in clinical trials. Next slide. So before we decided that PROTEUS was a catchy name for our consortium, we wanted to make sure that PROTEUS was not some tyrannical Greek god known for death and destruction. And we're pleased to discover that it's actually a pretty apt name for our endeavor. PROTEUS is one of the early prophetic gods of seas, and he is actually the god of elusive sea change. I think sea change is something that we can all agree is often aimed for, but not always achieved. And while PROTEUS can foretell the future, he'll do just about anything he can, including changing shapes to avoid doing so. But if you can capture the beast, he will answer to you. The adjectives flexibility, versatility, and adaptability are synonyms for protean and characteristics I think we can all aim for in our efforts with PROs. Next slide. As Lynn mentioned, we are incredibly pleased to have 27 organizations with PROTEUS participants, although we always mention that participating in PROTEUS does not imply endorsement of any particular PRO tools or guidance documents. The 27 organizations include clinician and patient advocacy groups, such as the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship and the American Society of Clinical Oncology, research and methods groups such as ISCOR and the International Society for Quality of Life Research, government and regulatory agencies such as the FDA and EMA, clinical trial funders such as the NCI and PCORI, and then groups like the National Clinical Trials Networks, the EORTC, the Clinical Trials Alliance in Australia, and so on, who are actually out there conducting clinical trials. Next slide. In leading the consortium, Michael and I are delighted to be supported by a steering committee from the US, UK, Europe, and Australia. And we particularly want to highlight the role of our patient advocate partner, Alyssa Thorner. Next slide. So in order for PROs to be effectively incorporated in clinical trials, You have to specify the methods appropriately, measure the PROs effectively, analyze the data properly, report the results clearly, all so that these findings can be applied in practice. Next slide. And what we have found in reviews that have been conducted to date is there are gaps in the quality of clinical trials that have been conducted so far, that the protocols are missing key information that leads to suboptimal implementation of the PROs when the clinical trial is being conducted, or the reports of the clinical trials that are published are missing key information that create barriers to interpreting and applying the PRO results. Now, fortunately, there are a number of tools available to help address these gaps in methods. Next slide. So for each of the steps I just mentioned in the clinical trial trajectory, there are actually guidance documents and resources available to provide researchers and clinical trialists the information they need to help design their study, implement their study, analyze their data, and report their findings. Next slide. So the challenge of PROTEUS is really to see how can we make sure that these guidance tools that Michael, Nora, and I and others are familiar with, but many clinical trialists out there are not. And so for our dissemination and implementation, or knowledge translation, as they say in Canada, is really the aim of PROTEUS. We are an effort to make sure that the resources out there are used and known about. Next slide. So we're using the knowledge to action framework to do this. And if you look at the center of this figure, you see that, you know, the goal is to take knowledge and to synthesize it down into useful tools and products. And fortunately for PROTEUS, lots of that work has already been done. So what PROTEUS is really aiming to do is to work our way around the circle of figuring out how to get those tools used in practice by adapting them to local needs and contexts, to understanding and addressing barriers, to emphasizing facilitators, and tailoring implementation intervention. Next slide. So these are the published documents that have been created to inform the use of clinical trials, but how do we make this information more usable and useful to folks out there in the field? So now I'm going to turn it over to Michael, who's going to provide a brief orientation to each of these resources, what they include, and how they might be helpful to you. Michael?
Thank you, Claire. So we're going to start with what we call the PROTEUS Roadmap. So this takes the tools that Claire's just mentioned and hangs them on an organizational framework, such as it is. The goal, of course, is on the right-hand side. We want to ensure high-quality PRO evidence from the clinical trials that we conduct in research databases, both in the US, but also, of course, internationally. And the top here is a simplified conceptualization of the life cycle of a clinical trial, protocol development, trial accrual, analysis, reporting, and clinical uptake. And these are the 6 tools I'm going to briefly describe one at a time. The curious wavy interlaced lines here emphasize the point that these tools work in isolation, but also work together. There's internal consistency among them, and they're really designed as a suite of products that will help generate high quality PROs from clinical trials and implement them effectively into practice. So the SPIRIT PRO guidance is an extension of the SPIRIT statement, which of course guides protocol quality in the clinical trials world. Mel Calvert and colleagues published the SPIRIT PRO extension in JAMA in 2018. And the emphasis of SPIRIT is ensuring that the science of PROs, the measurement science, is supported by appropriate protocol design. So in the introduction, these pro-specific research questions should be introduced, and pro-specific objectives or hypotheses should be developed in the introduction of the protocol. In the methods, any pro-specific eligibility criteria should be stipulated, and the pro-concepts and domains used to evaluate the intervention should be made clear. And that includes not only which domains, such as a physical functioning, but also the time points and the analysis metric that is relevant to that hypothesis. In terms of data collection, management, and analysis, the protocol should describe the pro measure, include a data collection plan, specify language versions that are available, state and justify the use of proxy reporting if that's required in a clinical trial, and specify strategies to minimize missing data, and if present, to address missing data in the analyses. Since the use of PROs in practice is increasing, the trial might also state whether the PRO data will be monitored to inform clinical care, as well as outcomes in the clinical trial. The second tool is the ISAQOL PRO measure selection standards, and this really is focused on choosing the PRO measure that is the best fit, or measures that are the best fit for the clinical trial. And we get asked these questions a lot: which measure should I choose? And the answer is always the same. Work through the recommendation standards, and it should be clear at the end of that which one you choose. Price-Reeve published this in 2013, and the recommendations basically look at all of the domains that are important for a measure. What conceptual and measurement model is that measure based on? How reliable is it? How valid is it? How are the scores interpreted? What translations are available? And what's the burden of the instrument on patients particularly, but also, if relevant, on investigators? Of course, the ISAQOL minimum standards is not the only guidance out there for choosing a best PRO measure. We were aware of that, and when the consortium was first coming together, the members of the consortium suggested we review all of the guidances out there and compare and contrast them. And Nora, who's going to speak in a minute, published the result of this descriptive analysis earlier this year. Across the top are the commonly cited guidances, the ISAQOL, COSMIN, EMA, FDA, and so on. And each row of this table is a domain that the measure should fit. And you can see by all the check marks that the measures are extremely consistent about advocating that all of these domains be addressed when choosing a PRO measure. Some of the measures add additional domains, as highlighted by the bullets at the bottom. The take-home message here is it probably doesn't matter really too much which one you use. You may pick one that's specific for a specific clinical trial application, but they all more or less do the same thing. And the important thing is that you use one of these guidances, that you don't just pick a measure and start using it without thinking through these different domains that support the science of PRO measurement. The third instrument here is the SysAQOL analysis guidance. This is really a work in progress. Cornel Cones, who's the lead statistician on the group, published this paper in Lancet Oncology in 2020. And this was preliminary recommendations of the SysAQOL consortium. SysAQOL stands for Setting International Standards for Analyzing Quality of Life Data. And so the idea here is international standards. And this paper was preliminary standards, and this is morphed now into a larger consortium called SysAQOL IMI, which is going to continue to develop these recommendations. But already from SysAQOL, there are some key recommendations that will be useful for clinical trialists. The nomenclature has been sorted out. The different types of objectives that you might address with the PRO data are well articulated. In other words, is this a treatment efficacy or a clinical benefit question? Is this a patient perspective tolerance question? Are there between arm comparisons that are relevant? Are there within group comparisons that are relevant? And so on. So again, the protocol should reflect this nomenclature recommended by SysAQOL. They also recommend common statistical practices for common types of analyses. For example, time to event objectives should use Cox proportional hazards, and repeated longitudinal data should use mixed linear models. I'm expecting that the statisticians in the group will have some questions about this, but these are the preliminary recommendations made by SYSAQUAL. Finally, the recommendations include how to handle missing data statistically, but also recommending collecting reasons for missing data routinely, such that the impact on potential bias can be better assessed. The fourth tool is the Consort Pro guidance. So now we've completed the trial, and this guidance looks at how to optimally report the pro aspects of the clinical trial. This was published by Mel Calvert and colleagues in JAMA in 2013, and this is an extension to the Consort standard guidance document. As you may guess, this reflects what we expected in the protocol. The abstract should identify a pro as a primary or secondary outcome, really for the purposes of indexing. So when you do searches on Medline or PubMed, it will come up in the abstract whether the trial had a PRO component to the study. And that's the reason for that recommendation. The rest follow common sense. The background should again state the hypothesis. The method should be clearly described. And the discussion, which personally I think is the most important part of a report, the discussion should put the PRO findings in clinical context so that clinicians can use the pro data, even though they might be not entirely familiar with the statistical reports or the graphs that are used in the study. Speaking of graphs used in the study, the second guidance document that addresses trial reporting is the Pro Data Display Guidance. This was published by Dr. Snyder and colleagues in Quality of Life Research in 2018. And this paper was a result of a Delphi process that sought to establish consensus recommendations for graphically displaying patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials. One thing the recommendations suggest is that data that's designed for patient-facing applications, such as educational materials or decision aids, be different from the graphic designs or visual strategies used for clinicians and researchers. So this slide is an example of patient-facing data. The trial arms are clearly labeled and they're color-coded. There's labels for directionality. In other words, a line going up for physical functioning means better for physical functioning. So it's kind of in your face, which way is up. For this particular instrument, where symptoms going up are worse, but physical functioning going up is better, the domains should be clearly separated so that different directionality domains are clustered together. To enforce the directionality differences, Y-axis descriptive labels should use at least anchors to show very high physical functioning, for example, versus severe fatigue at the top of the scale. And where data are available that allow the use of intermediate labels, in other words, if one can justify what constitutes a moderate amount of physical functioning for that particular instrument, those intermediate labels can also be placed on the Y-axis. Data display for clinicians is recommended to be slightly more complex. That was the consensus of the group based on the evidence base that we had to work with. So you'll see now black and white, owing to most journals publishing in black and white. The treatment lines are again clearly labeled. Confidence limits should always be shown to allow the reader to ascertain the precision around these differences. And where useful, an overall p-value or time point specific p-value can also be shown. Again, domains with different directionality are separated. Y-axis labels are used to reinforce directionality and intermediate scores. And we also recommend that where clinically important differences exist between treatment arms, at least for between arm comparisons, that those time points also be identified with a symbol that's described in the legend. Finally, the Clinician Users Guides helps clinicians that are interested in interpreting these papers, read them from a clinical appraisal standpoint. Albert Wu published this recommendation in 2014. And I won't go over this in detail, but you'll see again, everything is mirrored along the lines of supporting effective and quality science. So the clinician who's interested in critical appraising one of these papers should ask, was the assessment strategy appropriate? Was there a hypothesis? Was it the right measure that was used? Was it valid? And so on. So I'm going to hand over to Nora now, who's going to explain how we can make some of these tools more available and resources to make them more implementable. Go ahead, Nora.
Great, thank you, Michael. Yes, so I get the pleasure and the privilege of talking about all of the fun activities and projects that PROTEUS has developed to help implement and disseminate the use of these core tools into clinical trials for including PROs. Next slide, please. So our first work product has been the PROTEUS website, which you can access at www.theproteusconsortium.org. On our website, we have, which is still under development to some extent, but currently we have information about PROTEUS generally, helpful resources, opportunities to contact us, as well as many of the tools and resources discussed today and additional tools and resources. Next. So we will go to, thanks, Michael. So if we click on that tools and resources button, you'll pull up a page and you see all of the different core tools that PROTEUS has identified and which Michael has just reviewed, including those regarding writing protocols, selecting measures, analyzing data, reporting findings, graphically displaying data, and interpreting papers. So let's take a look at some of the resources available. We'll start with selecting the PRO measures. Next. Thank you. So as you select the tab for selecting PRO measures, what we have is several different resources available to users, including the PROTEUS core tool that's been identified, in this case, the ISO minimum standards. You've got a link directly to the article, a checklist summarizing the findings from the article, and different sets of web tutorials that explain the use of the article and explain the use of the tool in clinical trials. Next. So first we can see with the checklist, for checklists, and we have these in development for all of the different PROTEUS tools, for all of the different PROTEUS core tools. We have these user-friendly, high-level synopses of the different tools that can help users to get a bigger picture into what the tool might be beneficial for, how it can help them in their research study. Next. We also have web tutorials, including that go across two different levels. The first web tutorial is an overview video about the core tool itself. In this case, delivered by Bryce Reeve, who we're so fortunate to have on our steering committee, and who's also, of course, the lead author on the minimum standards. And in addition to this overview video, we have a more advanced video, which talks about the actual application and use of the ISO minimum standards in clinical trials and how it can be applied. Next. Let's take a look at another one of our resources. How about writing PRO protocols? Next. So here we have, again, the link to the article itself, the link to the tool. In this case, we're discussing this Spirit Pro extension. Next. And in addition, we again have one of these high-level user-friendly checklists that can direct readers to specific portions of the guidance that might be useful for them as they're going through or carrying out specific activities related to PROs in a clinical trial. Next. So here we have an overview of all of the different web tutorials. On the website, on the PROTEUS Consortium website, we have an introduction video regarding PROs and PROTEUS very generally, as well as another video that describes an introduction to the PROTEUS tools. Next. Finally, for each of the tools, we have two separate web tutorials, as you saw as an example on the ISO minimum standards page. And these two tools describe first an overview of the tool, and second, a more detailed application, explanation of the application of the tool in the clinical trial setting. So while these are fully developed currently for the ISO measure standards tool, we're under development for, the other videos are under development for the remaining tools. Next. Our second work product is a handbook that features all of the information that's available on our website and through our web tutorials, but in a written format that can be easily shared, downloaded, and reviewed. So this is under construction and coming soon. Next. Finally, obviously the importance of PROTEUS really lies in its ability to disseminate and implement information, but we're also academicians at heart, so writing papers is something we do often. Michael already discussed our first publication out of the PROTEUS Consortium, which reviewed international guidance on the selection of PRO measures, and this was published earlier this year in Quality of Life Research. In progress, we have a manuscript exploring what we're calling PRO's greatest hits. So it's really a description of different studies, clinical trials that used PROs and demonstrating the value of the PRO additions to those studies from different perspectives, including economic evaluation, cost utility analysis, health policy, and clinical decision-making. And Michael is leading that study. Finally, we have our PROs and grant applications paper, which explores the considerations that both applicants and funders should consider when reviewing protocols for clinical trials, including PROs. We're happy to report that that is in press at the BMJ currently and is led by Dr. Snyder. Next. And in very exciting news, we today discussed PROTEUS as kind of one body, but we're very excited to announce that we're also extending the remit of PROTEUS to consider not only the use of PROs in clinical trials, as we focused on today, but also optimizing the use of PROs in clinical practice and to help inform medical decision-making for individual patients. So while PROTEUS Trials continues to be funded by Genentech, PROTEUS Practice receives unrestricted funding from Pfizer to conduct this work. Next. So thank you very much. We will leave it there and turn it back to our hosts.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Nora, Claire, and Michael for 3 wonderful presentations that I'm especially excited to hear the PRO's greatest hits. We held a similar in a webinar last fall with a similar focus, specifically with our ECOG-ACRIN trials to demonstrate specifically for our collaborating community sites and for all of the research teams out there who work hard to collect this data. We held a presentation to share some of what we think are our most exciting and most informative results as a way to thank the many people who are involved in the collection and analysis of this data, and of course, including patients as well. So I have just a few comments and then we'll open it up to Q&A. I'm really excited to see what questions may come forward. I certainly have some of my own. As a reminder, you can send your, sorry for the flipping back and forth. There we go. All right, I have my notes now front and center. As a reminder, you can send your questions and comments to the panel by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Between our guest speakers and Dave Sella, Larry Wenzel, Alana Green, and myself, we will do our best to answer your questions and hope you're able to utilize this time to take advantage of the depth of great PRO expertise available during today's meeting. If you're comfortable doing so, please include your name with your questions so we can follow up with you by email if we run out of time during today's webinar. And I see that many questions have already been posted and answered as well. A few people have asked if this recording will be available. This will be posted on the ECOG-ACRIN website in a few weeks. As you're submitting your questions, I also want to share a preview of the next PRO working group webinar that is in planning for early fall of this year. This webinar will provide a deeper dive into PRO related resources and support available through ECOG-ACRIN, including a virtual tour of the PRO reference library that is currently under construction on the ECOG-ACRIN member website. And also, before I turn it over to my colleague Mary O'Connor to tell you more about what you can expect from the library, I just want to pause and share a tremendous round of applause. And I've been looking for the emoji buttons. Unfortunately, we don't have them. I was trying to figure out the best way to share virtual applause, but really want to share a tremendous thank you to Mary O'Connor, Elijah Patton, Sarah Bono, and Kippy Webster, our Northwestern ECOG-ACRIN PRO team for setting up today's wonderful event. And I'll turn it over to Mary to cover a preview of the PRO reference library.
Thanks so much, Lynn. We are really excited. The PRO working group has been working to build a online reference library that will be available in the fall on the ECOG-ACRIN website, the members only portion of the website. And that library is going to contain materials that can help guide the selection of PRO measures and their integration into studies, as well as dissemination, development of quality of life manuscripts. This information is definitely going to be intended as a complement, not only to the personal support and consultation that's available through members of the PRO working group, but also to some of the national and international guidance documents that our PROTEUS Consortium friends have been telling us about. As a matter of fact, you'll see in terms of some of the general content that we are planning for the library, the PROTEUS tools are front and center. We'll be providing links to all those tools via the ECOG-ACRIN reference library. And then there will be some other more ECOG-ACRIN specific resources. So for example, we'll have a lot more details and access to measures that are frequently used in ECOG-ACRIN studies, boilerplate language that you can use to describe those measures and put into protocols, as well as citations to validation manuscripts. We're also going to be providing, just for the most frequently used measures within ECOG-ACRIN, we're going to keep a list running of available translations, which languages they're available in, as well as provide some guidance on developing quality of life manuscripts and a directory of helpful resources. So PRO working group contacts, statistician contacts, other information that'll be helpful in terms of gathering assistance.
Terrific. Thank you, Mary. We look forward to the unveiling of this reference library. I think it will save many of us a lot of time and streamline also our ECOG-ACRIN protocol communications, and I think ultimately raise the bar of our PRO science. So we have been talking with the other research bases about creating a PRO-specific training curriculum. The Alliance has a PRO cheat sheet that Geeta has shared with us. We've had discussions also with Larry Wenzel and with Energy about creating a cross-research-based training curriculum. So please stay tuned for an email tomorrow with a link to a survey. Your responses will help us to tailor the next webinar and also solicit input on a cross-research-based training curriculum, topics that would be helpful, as well as topics for future webinars. Now I'm going to turn it to the Q&A portion of this meeting.
Okay, Lynn, this is Mary again. One of her questions is, where can I find guidance on ensuring quality PRO data collection during the trial?
That's an excellent question, and I think a universal challenge to us clinical trialists. Good quality PRO data collection and minimizing missingness. Claire, are there any materials through PROTEUS? I know that in some of the content from the presentation, there were discussions on how to handle missing data, but strategies on how to optimize data collection?
I'm actually going to have Michael address this one. Michael, if you want to turn on your camera.
Super.
Sure.
And I think we can get rid of the Q&A slide if we want to bring up the panel.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
No, it's cool. So yeah, we've talked about that a lot. It's pretty clear that in that trial life cycle, that's the one black hole that's missing guidance. How do you collect pros in the real world? And it's becoming more and more of a problem as we see more electronic modes, more interactions with clinical PROs. And at the end of the day, we decided it's probably research-based specific. So in Canada, we're working on one such guidance for the CCTG, but we don't expect to be easily translatable to other organizations because of things that are internationally different that are specific to the guidance recommendations. But yeah, it's a black hole, and it's a key element of quality PROs is data completeness, and lack of bias as much as is achievable in collecting the data, without coercing patients or getting just quick tick boxes because I have to do this. So we know it's a problem. We've done some qualitative work with our research CRAs, the people in the field collecting the data. They highlighted this as a key need for guidance. So that qualitative research was reported at ISAQUAL last year. If anybody's interested, Palmer was the first author. And it speaks to the need for this guidance, absolutely.
Great, that's very helpful. We'll track down that ISAQUAL presentation. And your point about it being research-based specific is a good one. We, a few years ago, through ECOG-ACRIN, had funding to support PRO collection on 2 trials, a breast cancer aromatase inhibitor head-to-head trial and a lymphoma trial, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma with 2 different dosing approaches for rituximab. And we had fantastic PRO collection when we had a dedicated coordinator who monitored the data submission in real time and notified sites in advance when forms were due. So, you have a patient coming in next week, please make sure to fill out your PRO forms. This was probably helpful maybe in 2 ways, as an organizational piece to make sure that the coordinator have this on their radar to collect, but also in terms of sending the message, we are looking for this data and monitoring it. It's important. And I've heard periodically that sometimes sites can misunderstand, our PRO endpoints and not understand them as really an essential part of the trial, but just rather optional, if time allows. So we'll certainly, take a look at that ISAQUAL presentation and consider to continue to strategize through ECOG-ACRIN. Larry, do you have anything to add in terms of what has worked well through Energy?
Well, I think you just pointed out an important point, which is that we need dedicated resources, both within the research base as well as institutionally, because we find huge variability in our institution error rate, or how well institutions do or don't capture data. So a lot of that is really boots on the ground and who's assigned to this task and how well they're trained. So I'd also add this important topic into the training curriculum itself as we move forward.
Great, really helpful. That's a great point. So I guess, either public applause or public shaming, depending on your philosophy. by institution, potentially. Dave, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, just add a few things. Completely agree with what Michael, Lynn, and Larry have said. I think some type of central monitoring from usually the data coordinating center is critically important. I think every group should take stock of its capacity and not commit to more PRO assessment than it can handle. There have been times in the history of Energy, at least my experience has mostly been with GOG, one of the legacy groups of Energy, and with ECOG, the legacy group of ECOG-ACRIN. And in both cases, the appetite for quality of life assessment exceeds the capacity of the group to resource data collection. So it's hard to say no, but I do think it's better to do 10 studies well than try to do 20 and just not have the resources, because then they all tend to fail under the data. So that's a local decision, to Michael's point, that each group needs to make. Like what's it willing to commit to? What can it commit to in terms of resources, and connect that communication to the people planning and deciding on which studies to prioritize for quality of life assessment. The other thing, just Alana, if I could just add one sure. thing. Yeah. The other thing is that you can improve. I've with ECOG and with GOG, with concerted efforts and a commitment to improve, have seen rates go up across the group 10 to 15%. And that takes us from what's usually around 70 to more like 85, which really changes the ability of you to treat treat longitudinal data as missing at random much more reasonably, or be able to defend it with the better journals. So it can be done, but it does take that commitment. Sorry, Alana, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were done. I was just going to add, I totally agree with you on centralizing the data collection, and we've had some success at ECOG-ACRIN by centralizing it at the Outcomes and Economics Assessment Unit, and also offering the option of either web or paper-based data collection. And again, that goes to your point of having adequate resources, because obviously we can't do it for every study. So we need to pick and choose which are the most appropriate studies to use this approach for.
And I think, just to clarify, not necessarily always centralizing data collection, but centralizing the monitoring of data collection quality. So data collection is still often usually done at the site. So I don't want people listening to think, oh, we're not supposed to collect the data anymore.
No,
We're still supposed to collect the data. But have the central monitoring.
Yeah, and I think that one of the issues we run into too is, even when you centrally monitor, getting the attention of the feet on the ground, the RAs that actually have to do it. They're overloaded. They've got so many things to do, and they may be getting zillions of emails a day. So finding a way to really interact with them so that we can alert them that a survey is due, I think would be really useful.
Sure.
Perhaps outside of email, using another, maybe using Rave or something.
So I have a question for the speakers. If
I have one other point on that before Dave's question. So just a small initiative that's underway regarding this question is it was identified as a priority by SysAQual, and I believe will be undertaken by SysAQual IMI, to develop a standardized case report form for reporting why pro assessments are missing.
Yeah.
And so that will inform analyses that need to take account in missing data, but I think as an indirect effect of it, it will show, like, we're going to be asking why it's not there if it isn't there. So that is another push to collect it.
Thanks for making that point. Yeah, that's a great point. And we have that form for our ECOG-ACRIN trials, and hands down, the most common reason is staff didn't give the form. I admire the staff for their honesty, and it helps us to know when this has happened. But that's a great point. And we'll make sure that that's continued to be included on our future trials. I also just yesterday was on a call with a study team. We're looking at taking a first look at PRO data from a trial. We're working on writing up our results, and made the point, again, that administering PROs, even when patients go off protocol, is still so important. And it really confuses everybody because the question is always, if you're interested in quality of life on this therapy and the patient stops getting that therapy, why do you care? But even just to have one more data point so that we can understand who's missing and how they differ, whether their health is better than our population or their health is oftentimes it's that they've deteriorated. And so we know our available PRO data is an overestimate. But thank you, Dewey. Mary and Kippy, do we have additional questions?
I think Dave had a question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah, it's okay. Well, first I want to thank Claire and Michael and Nora for taking time and giving us this presentation. And now we have it recorded for others, so we don't have to keep asking you to keep coming back. So thank you very much. PROTEUS, to my way of thinking, does a really good job of bringing together efforts, Spirit Pro and SysAQual, and the work that Bryce led with the paper that he led with how to select domains and instruments, and Claire's work on display to patients and to clinicians. So PROTEUS brings it all together. So it's nice to have a one-stop shop. So thank you for that. My question, because I didn't hear it in your presentation, although I might have missed it, is about translations. The NCI, as you know, is really trying to ensure that our cooperative group studies that are increasingly enrolling people that don't read or speak English to be able to participate, and not just Spanish, but other languages as well, Arabic, Chinese, etc. So there is, I guess my question is, do you know about this NCI initiative to translate a set of specific questionnaires to make sure that they're available for people that otherwise might have been excluded from at least the quality of life portion of a trial, if not the trial itself, depending on whether it's a primary outcome or not?
Yeah,
And-
so thanks.
And I guess the rate of the question, sorry, do you see that as part of the scope of Proteus to also sort of tackle that? Because it seems to be like a missing link.
Yeah, so thanks for raising that. And we did hear on a previous ECOG-ACRIN call, actually, that the NCI initiative to really drive translations, which is really exciting for the expansion and generalizability of our PRO studies. Translations and the availability of culturally appropriate questionnaires is one of the ISOQOL minimum standards for selecting a PRO measure. Is, are there available translations that were completed in a culturally appropriate way? That might not be sufficient if you think there's more on that. I know that the translation and cultural adaptation special interest group of ISOQOL has written some papers on that, and perhaps there are other resources that we can include on our website. So definitely open to suggestions on that.
Yeah, just to add briefly to that, the Spirit Pro extension also addresses translation, but in a generic sense, really emphasizing that if you do use translations, that they be validated and culturally appropriate. Not so much we should be promoting more and more languages, which is the point you're getting at, and I fully agree with. But I think that's beyond scope of what we're trying to do in Proteus, other to make sure that there's awareness of these issues, and then it's happening also in Canada, same issues. Mostly with Asian languages, but also our Indigenous population, which has 40 or 50 common dialects even within Native Canadian. So it's a huge deal, and I think each international group is struggling with broader representation on clinical trials.
Lynn, I know we're getting close to time, but we do have one other question, and it's, what is the role of the PRO working group in terms of PRO measure selection and protocol development?
Yeah, great question. Our PRO working group ideally pairs investigators who either clinicians who are also clinical trialists, or practicing clinicians who are interested in learning the PRO science, and pairs our clinical investigators with PRO experts to collaboratively work on PRO measure selection and on protocol development.
Yeah, I mean, just putting like sort of functional statements to that, I would say, so I along with others am very happy to get an email from the quality of life co-chair of a study, and not needing personally to go on the face page, but also not wanting to be the one to write the part of the protocol to go through approval. Happy to advise and do this on a fairly regular basis, where people will say, so I'm studying prostate cancer, or I got this bladder trial and I'm interested in X, Y, and Z, and this is they educate me about the context of the treatment trial and the questions that they have, and then I educate them about their assessment options and their obligation. They, meaning the person who goes on the face page, is to actually write that part of the concept and then protocol, but can lean on us, in my example, lean on me for sort of advice and direction along the way.
Yeah, very well stated. Thanks for putting the functional statements to my comments. Absolutely. I know we just have 2 minutes left. I have a question. It may or may not be quick, so we can always follow up by email if it's not. But I appreciated your comments during the Proteus presentation, also on PROs as actionable. And our Cancer Research Advocates Committee has been asking for years, you collect this data, why don't you put it into use? And we have increasingly, been appreciated the value in doing so. Do we need to make a decision scientifically between precise PRO measurement by, setting up a system where patients know that their PRO data is separate from their clinical team, and so they'll be more willing to share concerns about treatment tolerability or toxicities, sensitive information? Or can we dually accomplish the goal of precise and accurate PRO reporting with a clinical integration piece? And I hope that question makes sense.
Maybe I can deal with that one, Claire and Nora. So it's an age-old problem. For years, we insisted at our clinical trials group that the PROs not be seen by the clinicians for the very reasons that you state. We wanted scientifically robust data that patients could report in confidence. And we felt that sharing it with clinicians introduced potential biases that would interfere with the accuracy of the measure. Because you're right, patients don't like to admit that they're tolerating something poorly, especially if there's no additional option left for them. So, but in today's world of increasing PROs in practice, it's becoming a bigger problem. And we're trying to reconcile the scientific basis of anonymity with the need to manage patients based on their own reported PROs. So at the moment, we've got duplicity. We explain it to patients and say, this is the one that you need to fill out for your doctor and your nurse, and this is the one that you need to fill out for your study. If you don't mind doing both, we'd appreciate it. But I don't know how long that will last and whether we can keep doing that. But it's a big problem. There's no clear solution yet.
I appreciate hearing your thoughts. With that note, and we are at the end of the hour. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists today. Thank you again, Claire, Michael, and Nora, for a wonderful presentation. I hope we can ask you to come back again. And I look forward to seeing many of you on protocol-specific calls, and look forward to our next webinar this fall.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been wonderful for the option for us.
Terrific. Have a great summer.